The Alpha King turned away his crimson-haired Luna, unaware he had rejected a legend, a true life story. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a powerful man makes a decision he believes is final. Not the silence of agreement, not the silence of peace, the kind that holds its breath, waiting, because something in the air already knows what the man does not. That silence fell on a Tuesday, November, the kind of cold that does not knock before it enters. It simply moves in, through the window frames, through the seams of the heavy curtains, through the collar of every coat that was not thick enough. The trees outside had already let go of their leaves 2 weeks before, and now they stood bare and dark against a sky the color of old pewter. She was not dressed for the cold. That was the first thing the women in the room noticed. The men noticed other things, the crimson hair, wild and loose, the color of something on fire at the edges. The leather satchel, battered and overstuffed, the strap worn thin in one spot near the buckle, the boots, dark and old, a size or two too big, like she had borrowed them from someone larger and decided they were good enough. She had not tied them properly. The left lace was tucked rather than knotted, a small, careless choice that somehow made her look more certain of herself, not less. She walked in like someone who had taken the wrong turn and ended up in the right place entirely by accident. She had not taken the wrong turn, but no one in the room knew that yet. And the man at the head of the long table, Darian, did not know it most of all. Ren. His name was Darian Voss, and he had been told all his life that his instincts were his most reliable possession. Better than money, his father used to say. Better than land. Better than any alliance or any contract, which could both be broken. A man who trusts his gut will never be robbed of what matters most. He had heard this at the table where he grew up, from a man who said it the way other fathers said things about hard work or God, not as advice, but as received truth, the kind you absorb before you have the vocabulary to question it. He was 31. He had the kind of build that made rooms feel slightly smaller when he entered them, not because he was loud, but because he took up space the way stone takes up space. Quietly, permanently, without apology. He had run his house, his bloodline, his territory, his people, since he was 24. 7 years of decisions, hundreds of them. Big ones, small ones, the kind that kept him awake at 3 in the morning, and the kind he made before his coffee was finished. He had made mistakes. He was not the kind of man who pretended otherwise. But his mistakes were always in the details, never in the read, never in the first assessment, never in the gut. He believed, truly and without performance, that he had never been wrong about a person in his life. That belief would not survive the week. She knocked over a candle on her way through the door. Not dramatically, not catastrophically. Just a small silver candle on a side table near the entrance, her elbow catching it as she shifted her satchel from one shoulder to the other, the weight of it redistributing in a way she had not accounted for, and the whole thing rolling off the edge and landing on the polished floor with a sound that was far too loud for such a small object. She looked at it for a moment. The candle had gone out. Then she looked up at the room, which was looking back at her. "Sorry," she said. The word was genuine, but not embarrassed. The way you might say sorry to a dog you had accidentally stepped near. Matter of fact, a small acknowledgement, already moving on. She did not bend to pick the candle up. She noted it, apologized to it, and left it where it was. She set her satchel down in the nearest empty chair. The satchel made a thick sound when it landed, the sound of something heavy and densely packed. She looked at the long table with all its serious faces, took in the room with the same calm, thorough attention that a surveyor gives a landscape, and said, "I'm Mara Ashvale. I have an offer." Darian looked at her for approximately 4 seconds. He did not look at the crimson hair, though it was difficult to miss. It fell past her shoulders in a way that was clearly not intentional, not arranged, just there, the way weather is just there. He did not look at the boots, or the satchel, or the ink stains he would later notice had settled permanently into the skin of her left wrist, 3 fingers width above the bone. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, from the top, down, taking stock, building a picture, arriving at a conclusion. 4 seconds. He said, "Thank you for coming in." He said it the way you close a window that has been letting in a draft, not angrily, not rudely, simply with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided the temperature in the room is better managed another way. He nodded to the woman at the end of the table, his assistant, Petra, and Petra was already reaching for her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. "I'll have someone call you a car," he said. Mara Ashvale blinked, once, slowly. The way you blink when you are deciding whether what just happened is worth the energy of a reaction. She did not argue. She did not explain. She did not say what she had come to say, because the room had closed before she could open her mouth. She picked up her satchel. She walked past the candle on the floor. She took the car. He did not think about her after she left. That was the honest truth of it. Not a defense, not a justification, just a fact. The day moved on. It always did. There were 3 more meetings, a call with the Northern Territory that ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time, a legal document that needed to be reviewed before end of day, dinner with 2 men he did not trust but needed to keep close, a glass of something expensive that he did not finish because he was tired, and drinking alone when you were tired was a habit he had decided not to build. He did not think about the crimson hair. He did not think about the satchel or what might have been in it. He did not wonder about the offer she had come to make, or what would have happened if he had let her make it. He had made his assessment in 4 seconds, and his assessments were not wrong, and so there was nothing to wonder about. He slept well. He almost always did. Mara, for her part, ate leftover rice. She sat at the small table in her apartment, the one with one leg slightly shorter than the other 3, which she had fixed with a folded piece of cardboard 3 years ago and had never thought about again because it worked. And she ate the rice cold, straight from the container, and looked out the window at the street below. The street was wet. Someone was walking a dog that was too small for the leash it was on. A bus passed. She was not upset. That was the thing about her. People who would later hear this story always assumed she must have been devastated. Rejected by Darian Voss, a man whose name held weight in every room that mattered, sent away with a car she hadn't asked for before she'd said 2 sentences. Surely she had cried. Surely she had sat in the back of that car and pressed her face to the cold window and felt the particular loneliness of being looked at and found insufficient. She didn't. She had come with an offer. The offer had not been heard. The offer had therefore expired, not because it was worthless, but because its value was alive and time-sensitive, and it needed the right room to breathe in, and that room had closed before she could get the window open. She finished the rice. She set the container in the sink. She called a man named Rayo, who was the kind of person who answered his phone at any hour without making you feel like you owed him something for it. He picked up on the second ring. "He passed," she said. 3 words. She did not add anything. She did not explain, or qualify, or tell Rio how it had gone. On the other end, Rio said, "Understood," and the line went quiet for a beat, and then he said, "Okay, I'll reach out to the others," and she said yes, and that was the end of the call. Somewhere across the city, in the specific and unrecoverable way that certain windows close, a door had gone shut on Darian Voss's best chance at something he had been circling for 6 years without ever knowing what it looked like from the front. Mara opened her laptop. She started writing. The first thread pulled loose on a Thursday, 11 days later. Darian was at a dinner, the kind with too many forks and not enough honesty, at a house he had been to a dozen times, with the same 8 people he saw at these things, talking about the things they always talked about. The food was good. The conversation was the kind that sounds substantive but leaves nothing behind. A man named Callum, who ran the eastern branch of a trading house Darian had done business with for years, was talking to the woman on his left. Darian was not listening. He was calculating something in his head, running numbers on a deal he needed to close before the end of the month, when a name surfaced through the ambient noise of the table. "Ashvale," Callum said. He said it casually, the way you reference something everyone already knows. He laughed at whatever the woman said back to him, lifted his glass, moved on. Darian's fork stopped. Not dramatically. It simply stopped, halfway between the plate and his mouth, and he held it there for a second before he set it down and picked up his glass and said, with the practiced lightness of a man who has spent years making focused attention look like casual interest, "Which Ashvale?" Callum turned. He looked mildly surprised. "Mara Ashvale, the writer. Well, among other things." He said it like the other things were obvious, like the conversation assumed a foundation of knowledge that everyone at the table was standing on, and he was only now noticing that Darian might not be. Her grandmother built the framework. You know, the Northern routing system, the infrastructure that... He stopped. He read Darian's face. It was a small thing. Darian was good at keeping his face, but Callum had known him for 9 years, and 9 years is long enough to learn what a man's stillness means. "You didn't know," Callum said. Darian picked up his fork again. "Of course," he said, smoothly, as if agreeing with something already established, as if the floor had not just shifted, quietly, by perhaps a centimeter, in a way that no one else at the table would notice, but that he would feel in his feet for the rest of the evening. He ate the rest of his dinner. He did not taste a single bite of it. The Northern routing system. He knew it the way you know the structure of the house you grew up in, so thoroughly and foundationally that you stop perceiving it. It is simply what is there. The walls are where the walls are. The staircase is where it has always been. You have never once stopped to wonder who designed it. The Northern routing system was the invisible architecture of everything. The logic that kept trade flowing through territories that had no natural reason to cooperate with each other. The infrastructure that made his network possible, not by announcing itself, but by doing what good infrastructure does, disappearing into function. He had always assumed it had been built by a committee, a firm, some body of engineers and strategists whose names were in a foundational document he had never needed to read because the thing worked, and things that work don't require you to understand them from the inside. He had never asked. He asked now. He asked Petra, which meant it was handled with the thoroughness of someone who understood that when Darian Voss wanted to know something, he wanted to know all of it. What Petra found was this. A woman named Hannah Ashvale had built the framework. Not in a week, not in a year. Over 38 years, quietly, without announcement, through a series of decisions and interventions and structural refinements that no one had credited to a single source because she had not presented them that way. She had worked through other people's organizations, sent her ideas ahead of herself, let the solutions carry other names. It was the way women of her generation often did their most important work, not out of weakness but out of a specific, strategic understanding of how rooms worked and who was permitted to be heard in them and who wasn't. She had died 7 years ago. She had left everything to her granddaughter, who had crimson hair and ink-stained wrists and boots 2 sizes too big, who had walked into his house on a Tuesday in November with an overstuffed leather satchel and a candle knocked sideways, and 3 words, "I have an offer," and had been given a car before she could say the 4th. The second thread pulled loose on the following Monday. Darian's acquisition team sent him a 2-page memo. Dry language, the kind that delivers difficult information without seeming to know that it is difficult. The manuscript, the one they had been circling for 18 months, the one that had required careful, patient effort across 3 direct approaches and 1 near agreement that had collapsed at the last moment for reasons his team had never satisfactorily explained, had been withdrawn from the market. Privately acquired. The buyer's name was redacted per the terms of the arrangement. The agent's name was not. The agent was a woman named Delphine. Petra confirmed, within 4 hours, that Delphine had lunch every Thursday with Mara Ashvale. Darian read the memo twice. He set it face down on his desk. He looked out his window for a long time. The street below was the same street it always was. People moving. A delivery vehicle pulling away from a building across the road. A woman with a red umbrella. He thought about the satchel that had made a heavy, dense sound when it landed in the chair. The satchel that had been with her when she walked in and when she walked out. The satchel he had not asked about because he had already decided in 4 seconds that there was nothing in it worth asking about. The manuscript had been in the satchel. He was certain of it now. He did not have evidence, he could not prove it, but he was certain. She had been carrying it, she had come with it. She had walked through his door with 18 months of his team's most careful work, sitting in a battered leather bag on her shoulder, and he had handed her a car, and she had taken the manuscript with her when she went. A flag from legal. 2 patents embedded in infrastructure his house depended on. Nothing alarming on the surface. The kind of flag that got raised during quarterly review, and almost never produced anything more than a clarifying note. These produced something different. Both patents were 6 years old. Both were held by a small holding company with no public profile, no website, no staff directory. Clean corporate structure, nothing unusual, except that when Petra traced the ownership chain, it went through 4 entities before it resolved. It resolved to Mara Ashvale. 3 threads. 11 days. He sat with them for a full day before he did anything. Not out of paralysis, out of the specific discipline of a man who has learned, through years of making decisions under pressure, that the first response to a shock is rarely the right one. You sit with it. You let the initial reaction pass. You wait until you can look at the shape of a thing clearly before you decide how to move. He sat with it. The shape of the thing was this. He had been in the room with someone remarkable. She had come to make an offer that, based on what he now understood about who she was and what she was carrying, would have been worth hearing. He had looked at her for 4 seconds. He had made his assessment. He had sent her away. And then, in the 11 days that followed, the world had begun quietly revealing what he had turned down. Not through her, not through any action on her part, but simply through the normal motion of information through a network. Callum mentioning a name at a dinner, a memo from an acquisition team, a flag from legal. She had not arranged this. She had not orchestrated a reveal. She had simply gone back to her life, and her life was woven so thoroughly through the fabric of his world that it was always going to show up, eventually, once he started looking. He had just never looked before. He did something then that did not come naturally to him. He spent a week, quietly, alone, without telling Petra what he was doing, reading. He read her paper on systems theory, the one published under a different version of her name in a journal he'd heard of but never opened. He read the paper on the gap between how power was documented and how it actually moved. He read the third one, which was shorter and denser, and took him 2 attempts before he felt he understood what it was doing. He read the foundational documents for the Northern Routing System, the ones that had her grandmother's ideas in them, without her grandmother's name. He read them twice. He read them looking for fingerprints, for the specific texture of a particular intelligence, and he found them everywhere once he knew to look. He started to understand the specific quality of the mind he had dismissed in 4 seconds. It was not a dramatic mind. It was not a mind that announced itself. It was the kind of mind that looked at a system and asked questions that other people had not thought to ask yet, not because it was faster, but because it was patient in a particular way. Because it was willing to sit with a problem until the problem's shape became clear, and then address the shape rather than the surface. He recognized the quality because it was one he valued. He recognized it because he thought of himself as having it. The recognition sat in him uneasily. Like a fact he couldn't argue with, they made a decision. He sent a message through an intermediary, a man named Wren, who had a gift for moving between rooms without being noticed, for carrying things delicately. The message was simple. He was reaching out to ask if Mara Ashvale might be open to a conversation. The reply came back within 24 hours, from Mara's assistant. 1 paragraph, precise, professional, courteous in the way that a well-placed lock is courteous. It does not slam, it does not shout, it simply holds. Miss Ashvale appreciated the message. She wished him well in his future endeavors. That was it. No invitation. No question back. Not the outline of a possibility. The reply had the careful completeness of a sentence that did not leave room for a follow-up. 1. He sent another message. He tried a different angle, not through Wren this time, but through a mutual contact, a woman named Celeste who moved in circles where both their names appeared. He framed it as professional interest. He mentioned, specifically, one of the papers he had read. He was careful not to make it sound like discovery. He did not want to sound like a man who had looked her up after the fact and was now impressed. even though that was exactly what had happened. The reply was shorter. Same assistant. Same paragraph. She appreciated the message. She wished him well. Yen. He made a third attempt. This time he wrote it himself. Not through Ren, not through Celeste. He wrote it at his own desk, on a quiet Sunday evening, and revised it 4 times before sending it. He was careful in a way he was not always careful. He did not apologize. He was not ready to apologize. And she would have known if he wasn't ready. And a half-ready apology was worse than no apology. But he was specific. He named what he had done, in plain language, without dressing it up. He said he had made an assessment without adequate information. He said he understood that the offer she had brought was no longer available. He said he was not writing to retrieve what had passed, but because he respected the work, now that he had read it, and he wanted her to know that. He sent it. He waited. The reply came from the assistant. Ms. Ashvale appreciated the message. She wished him well in his future endeavors. Word for word. The weeks that followed had a particular quality to them. He kept working. The days were full in the way his days had always been full. Decisions and calls and meetings and the constant low hum of keeping something large and complicated moving in the right direction. From the outside, nothing had shifted. His house ran. His people did their work. The networks hummed. From the inside, something had moved. He started to notice things he had not noticed before. Not about her, about himself, about the 4-second assessment, which he made dozens of times a day, in every room he entered, at every table he sat across from someone new. He started to feel it differently, not as certainty, as habit. The distinction was small, but it was enormous. Certainty was earned. It was the product of real attention, of information gathered and processed carefully. Habit was automatic. It ran on its own. It did not stop to ask whether this situation was like the last one, or whether the person across from you was showing you their front or their depth. He had been running on habit and calling it certainty. That was the thing that settled in him, slowly, over those weeks, not as dramatic revelation, but as the quiet persistence of something true. He had trusted a mechanism that he had not maintained. He had called it instinct. It was reflex. And a reflex, however fast and however often it had worked, was not the same thing as being right. He found out about the dedication on a Friday in February, a scanned page. It reached him through a chain of 3 people, not arranged by anyone, not sent deliberately his way, just moving through the network the way documents moved, from hand to hand in the rooms where things circulated before they were public. Not the contents, just the dedication page. He read it standing at his desk. Then he sat down. He read it again. It said, "For my grandmother, who built the roads and let the credit go. This one has your name on it." He sat with it for a long time. What happened in him at that moment was not guilt, exactly. Guilt was something he knew. It had a shape, a specific weight, a direction. It pointed at something you'd done and pulled you toward fixing it. He had felt guilt before, in the particular situations where guilt was the accurate response. He knew how it worked. This was different. This was the feeling of looking at a cathedral and realizing you had been walking past it for years, thinking it was a storage building, and the cathedral itself had never corrected you. It had simply kept being what it was, its windows lit, its architecture intact, its doors open to whoever stopped and looked. He had walked past it. He had not stopped. He had glanced at it on a Tuesday in November and made a 4-second assessment and moved on. And the cathedral, this woman with crimson hair and ink-stained wrists and a candle she had knocked off a table, had not waited for him to come back. She had simply continued being what she was, letting her grandmother's name go back into the world, writing the dedication quietly, on a Sunday morning somewhere, in an apartment with a table that had one short leg and a window that looked at a wet street. He thought about that apartment. He had no reason to know what it looked like, but he was constructing it in his head from the pieces of her he had gathered over these months, the leftover rice that he had heard about secondhand, the boots that weren't hers, the satchel that she clearly used until it fell apart and then kept using. A woman like that had a table with a short leg. A table like that had cardboard under one foot. He was certain of it. He did not reach out again. He made that decision on the same Friday, sitting at his desk with the dedication page in his hand. Not because he had given up, not because pride had finally won. He had made 3 attempts, and the reply had been the same each time, and he had too much respect for the consistency of that reply to test it a 4th time. She was not playing hard to get. She was not waiting for a different approach. She had given him her answer, clearly, 3 times over, and the answer was complete. What he had lost was lost. Not destroyed. He understood that some of what she had built would continue to move through his world, would continue to support the infrastructure he lived inside, because it was woven into the fabric of things too thoroughly to be removed. He would continue to benefit from the roads her grandmother had built. He would continue to depend on the systems she herself had touched. He would benefit from her work without her presence. That was the particular shape of what he had earned in those 4 seconds. She started to hear her name with a different frequency, not because she had become more prominent. In the rooms that mattered, she had always been prominent, in the quiet way that certain people are prominent, the way a keystone is prominent in an arch. You don't see it when it is doing its job. You only notice it when it is gone, because then the whole thing falls. He started to hear her name because he was listening for it. The paper on power structures, the one he had finally read, had been cited at a conference he attended in January. He heard his own analyst reference it in a briefing. He heard a version of its central argument come out of a man's mouth at a dinner, paraphrased and unattributed, the way ideas travel when they have been absorbed and repeated enough times that no one remembers where they came from. He knew where it came from. He started tracing things backward. It was a habit he had developed without meaning to. Every time he encountered an idea, or a structural innovation, or a shift in how something worked that he couldn't immediately source, he would follow the thread until it terminated. More often than he had expected, it terminated at Ashvale, not always Mara. Sometimes Hannah, the grandmother, the woman who had built the roads. Sometimes the line was clear. Grandmother to granddaughter, hand to hand, the specific passing of a way of seeing. Sometimes it was less direct, a foundation that others had built on, an infrastructure that had enabled something Darian had always assumed was independently built. Nothing was independently built. That was the secondary lesson, the one that sat underneath the primary one. Nothing he had assumed was solid and self-sufficient had been actually self-sufficient. Everything rested on something. Most of the things it rested on had been built quietly, by people he had not thought to ask about. He had been walking on roads he did not know the name of. Naindid. He said her name out loud to himself once. Not in a meeting, not to Petra. Alone in his office, late on a Thursday in March, after everyone else had gone home. He had been reading her paper on the gap between how power was documented and how it actually moved, which he had now read 4 times and found new things in each time, and he had reached the last page and set it down and looked at the window and said, Mara Ashvale, like a fact he was trying to make permanent. Like the act of saying it out loud would help him hold it correctly. Not a regret, exactly, a recognition. The specific act of naming something clearly when you have been imprecise about it for too long. The window gave him nothing back. He turned off his desk lamp and went home. There is a particular kind of lesson that arrives differently for a proud person than for the rest of the world. Most lessons come and go. You misread something, you adjust. You move forward carrying slightly more information than you carried before. The error costs you something modest. The correction is clean. You are not the same person you were, but the change is small enough to be absorbed without disruption. A proud person's lessons work differently. Specifically, the lessons that arrive in the form of an error in the thing the proud person is most certain of, an error in the very mechanism they have built their confidence on. Those lessons do not stay in the past. They come back, quietly, without warning, at inconvenient moments. You are in a meeting, making an assessment, and something pulls. A small resistance in the familiar motion of deciding, a half-second of hesitation where there was no hesitation before. You are looking at someone across a table, and instead of the clean, swift read, there is a question, not a paralyzing question, just a quiet one. What else is here? What are you not seeing? What is in the satchel? You was not ruined by what had happened. He was not broken, or humbled into submission, or changed into a different kind of man. He still made decisions quickly. He still ran his house with the same competence and authority he had always used. The meetings happened, the deals closed, the networks continued their invisible, essential work. But something had been redistributed. Inside the confident mechanism of his judgment, there was now a counterweight, a small one, a correction factor, the memory of a Tuesday in November, and a 4-second assessment, and a car called before a sentence was finished. It made him slower by perhaps 1 second, perhaps 2. That 1 or 2 seconds had changed. In the months since, the outcomes of 3 things he could name, probably more that he couldn't. He had learned this without her presence, without her teaching him, without any action on her part aimed at his education. He had learned it from the fact of what he had done, and the facts that had followed, and the patient work of sitting with all of it until it resolved into something usable. That felt right to him. It felt like the only honest version of the lesson. Lessons that arrive through someone else's effort are borrowed. Lessons you arrive at on your own are yours. Shun. The manuscript found its readers in April. Not publicly, not yet. It moved through specific hands first, the way certain important documents move when the person who built them understands how information needs to travel before it can land correctly. 20 people, 30. People in the rooms that mattered, the ones who would understand what they were reading and know what to do with it. Darian was not among them. He knew this. He had not expected to be. He heard about it the way he heard about everything now, through the network, second-hand, a step or two removed. He heard that the people who read it were changed by it. He heard that one man had called it the most useful document he had encountered in a decade. He heard that a woman who had spent 30 years building something had read it and wept, not from sadness, but from the specific relief of having a thing you always knew but could not articulate, finally articulated clearly. He heard these things. He held them. He did not let himself wallow in what they meant about the offer he had not heard. That kind of wallowing was its own form of pride, the pride of the missed opportunity, which turned loss into a performance of loss. He was trying to be done with that kind of pride. There is a thing that people say, sometimes, about someone who is truly remarkable. Not remarkable in the way that announces itself with noise and brightness, but remarkable in the way that works below the surface, in the roots, in the structural bones of things. They say, you only know what you had after it has already become something else. Darian Voss knew what he had. Now, he knew it the way you know the name of a river after it has already carved the canyon. The canyon is simply there. It has been there for years. It will be there after you are gone. The river that made it, patient, moving at a pace that looks like stillness from the bank, is still going, somewhere further on, shaping what comes next. He had been standing at the canyon's edge, looking out at the shape of the land, never thinking about the water. Then one Tuesday in November, the water had walked through his door with a battered satchel and boots, 2 sizes too big, and he had sent it away before he understood what it was. And the river had kept moving.
Mara, for her part, was not thinking about him.
She had not been thinking about him for months. She had thought about him briefly, a few days after, in the quiet way you think about a door that turned out not to be the right door, without bitterness and without extended analysis. She had given it perhaps 20 minutes, distributed across 2 evenings, and then she had put it in the same drawer where she kept things that were over and moved on. She had things to do. She always had things to do. The boots that didn't fit had been replaced. New ones her own size, dark and warm, and she had noticed, for the first 2 weeks she wore them, how different it felt to walk in something that actually fit. Then she stopped noticing, because that was what happened when things were correct. They disappeared into comfort, and you got on with the rest. The manuscript was in the world now. Not public, not yet, but moving, which was the same thing. It was in the right rooms. It would find the rest of its readers in time. She had learned from her grandmother that the most important documents did not need to rush. They needed to arrive correctly. She was starting the next project. She had 3 index cards on her desk, with the bones of it sketched out, not an outline, because she did not work from outlines, but a direction, a question she had been sitting with for 2 years, which had now become specific enough to work from. She would sit with the index cards for another few weeks before she touched the actual document. She would let the question finish sharpening. She was patient in this the way her grandmother had been patient. This is not a story about a man who learns his lesson and gets the woman. That is a different story. It is a simpler one, and it arrives with a neater shape. The man makes his error. The woman is hurt but eventually forgiving. He proves himself changed. The door opens again. This story is not that. The door did not open again. Not because Mara held a grudge. She did not. Not because she was testing him. She wasn't. The door did not open again because the offer had been specific and alive and time-sensitive, and the moment for it had passed, and Mara Ashvale was not in the business of reconstructing moments that had passed. She was in the business of what came next. What came next did not include Darian Voss. He knew this. He had arrived at it, slowly, over the months of learning what he had turned away from, and it had not been comfortable knowledge. But it was honest, and honest knowledge has a particular weight that wrong but comfortable knowledge doesn't. He carried it. The specific grief of it lived in the ordinary moments, not in the big dramatic ones, not at the dinner with Callum when the name first surfaced, not when the memo arrived about the manuscript. Those moments had been sharp and manageable. You could deal with a sharp thing. You knew what you were dealing with. The grief lived in the Tuesday mornings. Because every Tuesday, for months, he had the same experience, a kind of peripheral awareness, like a word on the tip of your tongue, of something that had happened on a Tuesday and had not been resolved and would not be resolved. He would be doing something ordinary, reading a report, drinking his coffee, looking out the window, and the specific quality of Tuesday morning light would touch something in him that did not have a name yet, and he would be in November again, for a moment, looking at a woman with crimson hair and 4 seconds on the clock. And then the moment would pass, and he would finish his coffee, and he would go to work. The story does not have a resolution in the traditional sense. Resolutions are for stories where something was broken and got fixed. This story is about something that was not given the chance to be built. What it has instead is an aftermath, which is what most of real life has. Not resolution, but the long, ordinary continuation of things after the significant moment has passed. Darian Voss continued to lead his house. He made decisions, many of them good ones, some of them ones he revised later. He asked more questions, not performatively. He was not a man who had converted his error into a public sermon about humility. He simply, privately, asked more questions before he concluded. He gave people the room they needed to show him what they were carrying. That was the change. That was what the 4 seconds on a Tuesday in November had cost him and bought him simultaneously.
Ian.
The networks continued humming. The northern infrastructure, built over 38 years by a woman whose name had not been on the things she built, kept doing what it had always done. Quietly, structurally, in the bones of everything that ran on top of it. Mara knew every joint, every beam, every load-bearing wall. She had grown up learning it the way other children learned the street their house was on. Her grandmother had taught her, not by explaining, but by asking, "What is holding this up? What happens if this changes? What does this depend on that it does not know it depends on?" She asked those questions now, every day, about the new project. She would ask them until she had the answer, and when she had the answer, she would write it down, clearly, in plain language, in a document that would find its readers when it was ready. Some rejections are moments. They last 4 seconds and then they are over, and the people involved move forward, and no lasting weight attaches to either of them. The assessment was incorrect, but the correction comes quickly, and the damage is small, and some rejections become the hinge, the specific point around which the whole shape of a story bends. Not because the rejection itself was so extraordinary, because of what was being rejected, and what the person being rejected did next, and the long, quiet shadow that the moment cast forward into everything that followed. Darian Voss stood on one side of that hinge without knowing it existed. He stood on the other side without knowing when he had crossed. He only knew, slowly, in pieces, in the ordinary Tuesdays of the months that followed, that the woman with the crimson hair and the ink-stained wrist and the boots 2 sizes too big had not come to his house to be seen. She had come to offer him something. He had offered her a car instead, and she had taken it. And the offer, that specific, living, time-bound thing she had been carrying in a battered satchel on a shoulder that was clearly used to carrying things, had simply moved on, found its room, opened somewhere else. Mara stood at her window on a Thursday evening, appeared in the dedication of the most significant document of that year. Her granddaughter put it there. She made sure. Amara stood at her window on a Thursday evening in late spring. The street below was different from November, warmer, the trees filled back in, people moving without their coats pulled tight. She had a cup of tea going cold on the table behind her. She was thinking about the third index card, which was the one she hadn't cracked yet. She was not thinking about Darian Voss. She was thinking about the question on the card, which was about how certain kinds of knowledge resisted being documented, not because the people who held it were secretive, but because the knowledge lived in the practice, in the doing, and the translation into language always lost something essential. Her grandmother had known this. She was trying to figure out how to write about it anyway. The tea went cold. She picked it up and finished it. She sat down at her desk and wrote the first sentence of the new project. Outside, the trees held their leaves the way they always did in the warmer months, without effort, without announcement, simply doing what trees do when the conditions are right. She wrote the second sentence, then the third. End. The legend was established in the rejection. Everything after is just the world catching up.